Welcome back to the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. In this video, we're going to be implementing continuous integration and deployment, or CI/CD, with our two SQL databases. One database is an SSDT project, and the other is an entity framework database. So we'll actually be performing two different approaches for this one topic. Now, for those of you who are Patreon members at the $5 per month level or higher, make sure you head over and get the source code for today's video. Now, if you're just new to this project, welcome. If you're just interested in this topic, I think you'll get a great introduction in a real-world setting. Now, if you'd like to start the project from the beginning with us, there's a link in the description for the full playlist in order. There's also a link to the Phase 1 course if you want to get up to speed faster, and the source code for each step along the way. Either way, I'd appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up or a like. Doing so helps spread the word and ensure that more people will be helped with this video. Okay, let's go over to the browser and kind of review where we're at. So we have our API on Azure. We also have two databases. We have the Auth database, which is our entity framework database that's used for Microsoft Identity. And the other is the TimCo Data database, which is our SSDT, or SQL Server Data Tools project that gets deployed into a database. So two different types of databases, one that we control by manually creating it, the other is created by Entity Framework. Right now, we manually deployed both of these databases, but now we want to put this into our CI/CD process so that when we make a change in our source code, and you push that, not only does the API get pushed to the cloud, but also our database changes go to the cloud as well. So to do that, what we're going to do is modify, this is our Azure DevOps account, we're going to modify our pipelines. So our pipeline is our continuous integration of our source code right now. And then we have our release, which is our continuous deployment, again, of just our source code right now. So let's go to pipelines, and we're going to select this pipeline. We're going to hit edit. So this is our CI portion, our continuous integration portion. And in here, we have a number of things that's happening. Right now, we're doing a .NET publish. So we're doing a NuGet 5.4.0, and then a restore, and then a .NET publish. And this is going to be for API. This is our API publish. Then we create an API drop folder for that. Then we delete the API files. Then we do another build. And this build is doing the SQL project. And then it's doing a publish to the SQL drop location. Then deleting the SQL files. So you already have some SQL stuff being built. And that's the SSDT project. So this right here, we shouldn't have to change. Then we have our WPF project and our publish of that WPF project. So that's what we have so far. We need to now add another build process or build step in here, and that is the build of our entity framework database. Because entity framework, normally what you do is you apply migrations. But how do you do that in continuous integration? Well, it's going to take some scripting. And never fear, the scripting is not difficult. We're going to walk through how to do it. So let's add a couple of jobs here. First of all, I'm going to duplicate this delete SQL files, which if you notice, it's just deleting the whole directory. We call it different things, but this delete just deletes everything in this staging directory to kind of clean it up for the next step. So let's just duplicate this. I'm going to right click on it and say clone task. And I'm going to move this task down at the bottom here. Sorry, it's kind of cutting off the screen a little bit. I'm not sure why. But instead of saying delete SQL files, I'm going to say delete WPF files and take the copy off. So now it's deleting the WPF files. Again, it's just a naming thing. The actual deletion is going to delete everything from the build.artifact staging directory. So a staging directory is the place where we're sending our temporarily completed build files before we zip them up into a file. So for example, our .NET publish here, which we're doing a Linux 64-bit publish of our API, that's getting put into that artifact staging directory. And then we're taking the path that artifact staging directory, and we're zipping the whole thing up. So we want to go to the next step. We want to wipe that out and start a clean or empty directory. So not kind of, bring multiple sets of files along with us by the time we're done. So that's what we're doing here. So we're just kind of cleaning that up and starting over from scratch with nothing in that folder. Now let's add a new task. So notice the blue plus button here under Agent Job 1. We're going to add a new task. We're going to scroll down here and we're going to select the command line. Hit Add. And now we have a command line script. And this allows you to run multiple commands, one or more, inside this script section. So every carriage return is a new command. So let's remove those, which are the samples that just say, hey, hello world, basically. And instead, let's say .NET, which is a command line argument you can run against a command prompt as long as you have .NET installed on the system, which this build system will have to in order to do the publish and everything else. So it has .NET here, but what it doesn't have is the entity framework tools. So .NET tool install -- global space .NET -ef. All right, so that's what it's going to do is it's going to use the .NET command line to say, hey, I want a tool, and in fact, I want to install a tool. And I'm going to install it globally, meaning it's available for everybody in this same agent to access. And that tool is going to be the .NET -ef. These are the entity framework tooling for the command line. I hit enter to go to the next line, and on this line, I'm going to say .NET again, EF, this is our new command we just installed, our command system, migrations, script. So I'm saying here is, hey, I'm going to create a migrations script for an entity framework database. Cool. Now, -I. What -I says is that I want to have this script have all the possible options. Normally, when an entity framework database does a migration, it looks at a database and says, what version are you at? And then based upon that, it figures out what you have left. Meaning if you're on version 4 and the entity framework code is on version 7, it's going to move you from 4 to 7. And so it figures out what the differences are between 4 and 7, and it builds those for you. But we're not connecting to our destination database and doing a comparison. Therefore, we're using the -I command, which says, put everything in that script. And then have the script be intelligent enough to not break anything, but to upgrade from whatever level it's at currently to the correct level. All right. So if you're on version 3 and you're going to 7, no problem. You're on version 2, go to 7, not a problem. If you're on version 7 and it's going to version 7, no problem. It's not going to break anything. So it should be able to run no matter what against any database. That's the -I command. -O, not 0, O, that stands for where's the output going? Well, $, open paren, build dot artifact staging directory. Then close paren / migrate.sql. So it's going to say, I want you to put it in the build.artifact staging directory. That's that same location we saw up here and up here. Remember, that's that kind of place where we put all of our files before we then publish them. So I want you to put it there. I want you to call it migrate.sql. That's our migration file. And then I'm going to do a space after this and do -P. And this is going to say, what project do you want to run this against? In my case, I want the TRM API slash, let's move the cursor out of the way, TRM API slash TRM API.cs proj. That's the project to run against. So that's the one that has the entity framework database associated with it. Therefore, that's the one we want to run this against for the migration script. So there's 2 lines. They're going to create an output of migrate.sql in the artifact staging directory. With that, we have one more thing, which is to publish, which I'm going to copy the publish.apf. I'm going to clone this. I'm going to move it down below the command script. I'm going to rename it publish. And this is going to be the auth db script. We're going to publish that same directory. We're going to call it our auth db drop. So now you have our auth authentication database. That's going to create a drop file for us. So that's what we did. We added one more step in our process. We already have our SQL right here. This is actually right here. This is creating our DAC pack file for us for our SSDT project. And so we have that being published to SQL drop. And now we have another published, this one to auth-db drop, that is our entity framework migration. Let's save this and queue it to make sure it runs. So we save and run. And what this will do, it'll kick a job off right now that's based upon the latest source code. And it's going to run through the whole process. This is going to be a little bit larger a build process. We can optimize this in the future, but for right now, this build process works just fine. It's not overly long. I think it's like 5 minutes or something like that, 3 minutes. But in the end, we'll have something that works. Then you can always make it faster, make it more optimized, change how the system works or what things work in what order. That's fine. But for now, again, it works. If you click on Agent Job 1, you can actually see the job work the way through. And if there's any problems, it will put a red check mark, a red X here versus the green check mark. And you can read the logs as you go. Those logs are also available after the fact if you want to come back and review something. So let's pause the video right here. I won't make you sit through this whole process, but I'll come back once it completes. And we're done. I think I said between 3 and 5 minutes to run. It's actually 4 minutes flat. So it looks like it all ran fine. If we look at the command line script, we can see that there's no errors in here. The build started, build succeeded, and it said that it initialized the application DB context. Let's check and see if it actually worked. So scripts can say they work, but make sure that if you don't just take them at their word, actually check out the results, because that's what matters. It's kind of like being a software developer. Yes, it's important how you build stuff sometimes, but the real proof of your development ability is the output, what you actually accomplish, not how you accomplished it as much as what you did. Well, in this case, it's the same way. It's not really how you did the job, it's did you get the output you said you were going to. So this is our build. This is 2020-09-05.1 build. And we've got 5 published items. If we click open on this, we see that we have the build.source label, which is basically we're ignoring that. But then we have API drop, auth db drop, SQL drop, and WPF drop. We already had SQL drop. In that is the DAC pack file. But now we have the auth db drop, which inside there is the migrate.sql file. If we click on it, we could actually open that, which I believe, let's open that with Notepad. Sorry, just a minute. There we go. And now we can see that we have the if the history is null, then create the table. If not exists the history, then create the table for this as well. Same with all the rest of these. And then go through here and then add indexes if they don't already exist. So this is all pretty standard stuff. And what it's doing is it first creates this migration history table. And then it says, hey, if the migration history where migration ID equals create identity schema doesn't exist, then create the table. Essentially, if the create identity schema commit or the migration checkpoint, if that doesn't exist in the migration history table, which it won't if it just created this, if it doesn't exist, then do the things that are in that step. And it's going to go through all the different steps or versions of your entity framework database and make sure that they have all been applied. So it's going to check that history table just like it would normally, only this is in script format instead of the tools talking directly to the database. So let's close this down. We now know we have continuous integration on our two databases. We have our DAC file for our SSDT project, and we have our entity framework SQL migration script for our auth database. So now let's go to the releases section, the continuous deployment, and let's edit our deployment. And in here we have one job, one task, deploy Azure App Service. Well, we want to do more than that. We want to not just deploy the API, but also our databases. To do this, let's click the plus button on Run on Agent. This allows us to add another task. Let's go to Deploy. In here we have, down here, Azure SQL Database Deployment. So let's select this. Let's rename this to be our authDB deploy. And then for our Azure subscription, we're going to choose the one that is already linked to this account. And then we need to have SQL authentication for our database. For our SQL Server, we need to put in the SQL Server name, the database name, the login name, and a password. Well, the name is pretty easy. You can go back to the Azure, and we can go to, this is our authDB, so let's click authDB. It doesn't really matter because in here we have the server name is timcosql.database.windows.net. I'm going to copy that. It'll be the same for the data, timcosql.database.windows.net. It's the same one, so we can use that for both. Now, I could just paste that in right here, but I'm going to create a variable. Let's create a variable, and in here, I'm going to say add, let's call this our SQL server, and our value, remember you can paste this in and have it show, or you can lock it first and then paste it in, and it doesn't show. And the scope for this is going to be release or development. And what that allows us to do is say only part of the pipeline or the whole pipeline. We'll leave it at release. And we're going to come back over here. So this is SQL Server, we called it. So on this job, we can say $SQL Server like so. And that's now our SQL Server. It's going to pull the database name from that location, which means that when we duplicate this, that's one less thing we have to change. So that's that variable right there. The next variable is going to be our authDB name. And our authDB name is going to be TimCo Auth. We don't have to lock that. And just for completeness, we're going to create the our data DB name, which is TimCo Data. So that's both databases. We'll use the other one later on. But let's grab this. We'll come back over to our tasks. We'll come back to our database name here. Then I'm going to put my $, open parens, auth_db name, and close parens. Now my login name and password. Well, again, I'm going to put these in my variables, but I'm going to lock these down. So SQL username, and I'm going to lock it to begin with, and I'm going to paste that in, and then SQL password. And again, I'm going to lock that down, and then I'm going to paste that in. So now I have my SQL username and SQL password. So that right here is SQL username. And the next one is SQL password, like so. So that's our username and password, our authentication database name, and our server name, all coming from our variables. So now those are all in our variables. We can actually change them here and change them for our pipeline, so that if, for example, we just changed our SQL server itself. So we changed from one SQL server to a different one, not a problem. We could just change this variable and it would change for both tasks once we have both tasks in place. That's probably not going to happen, but this also allows us to lock down those variables, so it's a nice added benefit. So there we go. We're going to deploy not a DAC file, but a SQL script. And the SQL script is going to come from, let's open up this and say SQL drop. Nope, it's our auth_db drop. Inside there's our migrate.sql. No extra arguments to add. Note down here that there is a firewall argument, and it says auto detect the firewall and delete the rule after task ends. What this does is it puts a rule in your SQL Server firewall to allow this machine, the build machine, to talk to your Azure SQL database. That's important because if you don't have that, then it couldn't talk. You'd have a problem trying to run this migration script. So it's important you have that in place. This is not the same IP address as your personal machine. Just make that clear here. When you add, let me show you. Go back to your SQL database, and there's that set server firewall, and you can add a firewall rule for your client IP address. Well, and then just add client IP address like so, and then you hit save. Well, when you do so, this allows that IP address to come through the firewall. But that's not allowing, that's not allowing this system, this Azure DevOps, because Azure DevOps runs on a build server, not on your machine. Therefore, it has a different IP address. Therefore, you have to have this firewall rule in place, which it's going to create the firewall rule, and then it's going to delete that rule after the task ends. So very safe to do so. And you may ask, well, how does it know to do that? How does it have the permissions to do that? Well, you've already linked this to your Azure account. So it already has some permissions based upon the fact that it's linked to your Azure account. So it knows to do that. So there we go. That should be all we need for the auth_db deploy. Now let's clone this. We're going to change this to be DataDB deploy. We're going to leave this is the DataDB name. Same SQL server, same username, same password. It's not a script though, it's a DAC file. We are going to publish that DAC file, and let's go look for the DAC file in the SQL drop DAC. Hit OK. That should be all we need. Again, there's a firewall rule down there that makes sure that that's enabled. And now I think that we're all done. We're going to find out in a minute, because whenever you do changes like this, I know the CI portion went well, the continuous integration portion went well, but you're never quite sure until you try it. So let's create a release, which is going to trigger off that latest build. Now it says release 10 has been created. Let's click on that. And let's walk through this process. Let's go to logs. And it's going to start going through this process of deploying our application. First up, it's going to download all the different drop files. So it's going to grab them all, make sure it has them all. And then once it's done that, then it can move on to deploying to our API and then deploying to our two databases. I'll pause this process. It shouldn't take too long, but sometimes the API deployment especially takes a little bit of time because of the fact that we're using the free Azure DevOps agent, which is a little slower and it's shared, and we're using the free API, which turns itself off if it hasn't been used in a little bit. And I didn't warm it up before this video, so that may take a little bit to do the first time, and it's still a little bit slow because of those using free on both sides. Just note that when you're using free stuff, it's gonna be a little slower. You get what you pay for. We're not paying anything for this. So just note that don't get too frustrated by that, because again, you're not paying for it. And there you go. You now have an error in your build process. And it got through the first part, which we knew was working, which was to deploy to the API itself, which let's just check to make sure that API is up and running. I'll come back to that in just a minute while it loads. But then it failed right away on the authDB deploy. So this didn't work, which is our SQL script. And it says the current operating system is not compatible or capable of running this task. That typically means the task was written for Windows only. For example, written for Windows Desktop PowerShell. Well, that doesn't seem to make sense to me because of the fact that we're not running a specific task. We're running just a SQL statement using their tool. So this gives us no more information, but let's go back to edit the pipeline. And so jump us right into the pipeline, go to the 3 tasks, and then in here we can look at this task. First, let's check to make sure there's not a newer version of this. There's not. And this is connection type of Azure Resource Manager or Azure Classic. We might want to play around with that, but I think this should work. And then it says SQL authentication for the server, the database, the username and the password, a script, and then the script location. Not much here to change. So let's do this. Let's disable this task, and actually I'm going to disable the deploy the API as well. And the reason why is this just lets us run just the task we want to, which is this other one, to see if it fails or not. This is our first step in debugging, is seeing, is it this specific task or is it this this type of task? We have 2 of them. Let's see if one works and one doesn't, or if both fail. That will help us narrow down, or at least point us in the right direction of where to go. Either looking at the SQL statement itself, maybe see if that's not right, or then looking at the task type instead. So let's save this and create a release. And this should take a little less time because of the fact that it's not doing as much. It's just deploying our one piece. Now again, we have to wait for the agent and so on. The API, by the way, is up. So if we go to /API/Swagger, that's not it. Let's go to /API. There's nothing there. Is it just Swagger? There we go. It's not API/Swagger. It's just Swagger. Okay. So it's been a little bit since I've been to the API's Swagger, which needs some work, by the way. But this is working. Our API is still working, even though we redeployed it to this site. All right. So now this is not working either. The data DB deploy is also not working. It's saying, hey, I can't run that against the server. So now we have valuable information about what's going on. It's not our specific task that's the problem, it's the task type it appears. Let's go back and edit the pipeline. And in here, let's go to the 3 tasks. Let's look at this Azure SQL database deployment. Let's learn more about this task just to see if there's anything weird going on here, like maybe it's marked as deprecated or something else. So I scrolled some more when I paused the video. I just didn't want you to watch me scroll the screen. But right down here, known limitations, it does say the task does not put in a demand for SQL Server PowerShell, and that is needed to run the SQL Server scripts against Azure SQL Database. Install the feature pack as described above, else the task will fail to deploy SQL Server scripts. So this is saying we have to have either this feature pack installed or we have to have Azure PowerShell installed. I'm thinking this might not be the right installer for us. So let's go back over here and look. Let's go back to Add and go to Deploy and look for other SQL options. So we stopped at Azure SQL Database Deployment. But if we keep going, I think that, down here is the SQL Server Database Deploy. Let's add that instead. Just test this out and see if this works. We'll just do it with 1. So this would be, let's call it the DataDB Deploy. Just like before, the DACPack file is going to be our same DACPack file, which is the SQL drop. There we go. And using server, this is going to be on, instead of server name, we're going to say, let's grab that server name from here. Server name, we're going to do SQL Server Authentication, which that's going to be our username and our password. I'm just copying and pasting these to make it simple. Our publish profile is nothing. Oops, I put the SQL Server in the database name spot. That's not right. So let's change this. I was looking for that database name. There we go. So now we have our 4 pieces of information, which every deployment is going to need 4 pieces of information. It's going to need your server name, your database name, your username, and your password. So the first 2 tell it where to go. First one's the big one. Where is the location where your databases are running? That's the server that's powering your database. But then specifically, which database on that server, since it might be multiple. In our case, there are multiple. And then once you've got the location of that database, how do you get into it? What's the username and password in order to get through and log into it? So that should be what we need. I don't see in here, though, a firewall rule. So we got to make sure that there's a firewall handled here. This is only version 0 of this. Let's just disable this other task, and we're going to run this task and just see if this works. This is part of the experimentation process to see if maybe we just need this instead. I'm thinking there's going to be a problem here with the firewall, but let's create a release. It doesn't hurt, and then from there we can figure out if we have to go back to the original task and somehow install PowerShell on our build agent or something else. Let's go look at this and see what it says for our agent. Shouldn't take too long this time. It just downloads artifacts and running this last one. So we'll watch this walk through. Doesn't hurt for a few seconds to go by, right? And it says that same error. So the current operating system is not capable of running this task. It means it's Windows only. So that was a good experiment, but it did not work. So let's go back and edit the pipeline. We're going to get rid of that since we don't want to do that necessarily. Let's go back here and let's do this. Let's go back to our agent. Our agent right now is running Ubuntu 18.04. Well, that's not Windows. So we don't have PowerShell installed on this. So we either have to install PowerShell on this, or we have to do another part of our pipeline. Let's leave here. That's fine. Oh, I went too far. Edit. So we could create either another stage, or we could create another job after this, which let's just do an empty job, and we jump into this. And now this could be a different, in this case, we could do VS 2017 or Windows 2019, which makes more sense, I think, and bring our variables over into that. I think that's probably more what we want to do. So let's go back to the pipeline, and what we're going to do is, let's see if we can clone this. Yes, we can. So in this one, we're going to delete it. We're going to delete stage 1, and we're going to clone this, and we're going to say that this is our, let's call this SQL deployment. And this one over here is going to be our code deployment. Let's call it that. And then inside of our SQL deployment, we're going to enable just, well, first of all, we're going to delete that task. We're going to enable, let's enable both of them. So we're going to say enable selected tasks, and then I'll get rid of the API deployment. But this agent now is going to be, instead of Ubuntu, it's going to be Windows 2019. So it's an experiment, but let's see how it works. So we're going to hit save on this. We're not going to run it yet. Let's go back to pipeline, go back over to code, not development, that'd be deployment. There we go. Go to tasks. Let's remove that selected task. Let's not enable any of these. Just going to skip right over this and then go on to SQL deployment. And let's just see if this works. Again, we are experimenting with different things, trying to figure out what's going to work for us. Let's create the release. Hit create. We've created release 13, lucky number 13. Let's see what happens for this. So it should connect, and then it should move on to the next stage. So stage 1 is done, but let's go now to the SQL deployment and wait for that portion. Now that's in the queue. And now this is running just the deploy. So it's going to download the artifacts, and then it's going to deploy just the ones it needs. And thanks to the magic of video, you didn't have to sit through what ended up being a 3-minute and 20-second process. But the good news is we actually deployed our databases. If we go back to our API and refresh it, it still seems to work. If we log in here, we still should see, if I use my actual secret password, it should acknowledge that I've logged in. Let's wait for it. It did. Now it still says register and log in. It's not remembering that right, but that's not the database fault. That's actually a problem with how we've configured things. We have to update. But this is still working. So now we have our databases deploying successfully. Let's go edit this job now one more time. Let's edit the pipeline. Let's go to our code deployment. Let's enable this task, and let's select these 2 tasks and remove them. So now we have just our deploying Azure API. This should actually be called deploy API to Azure. Sounds better. So now we've got our deployment for code, and we have our SQL deployment as well. And they use different build agents. And the reason why is because the Ubuntu one works better for deploying to our Linux server. We're using a Linux-based API, and we're publishing to a Linux server. So that seemed to work better, I think. I'm not positive. It may have worked fine with Windows 2019. Maybe it worked just fine. But this shows you how to kind of group those if you want to. We could also put some limitations on here and say, hey, you know what? That may want to schedule this and may want to have other gates, like if a person has to sign off first before we can actually deploy to our SQL server. So it's up to us, but for now, I think we're going to leave it just as it is. So now we have our continuous deployment set up so that when we build something, when we push code to our repository, it's going to trigger a continuous integration build, which is going to build everything, our databases and our code. And then from there, it's going to take the output of that and it's going to do continuous deployment, where it's going to deploy our API, and now it's also going to deploy our entity framework database and our SSDT database, both to Azure SQL databases. And they'll go in these databases right here. So now we have all three of these on continuous integration and continuous deployment. Now we still have more steps to go. I want to then update our WPF project and set that to be continuous deployment as well. We have continuous integration kind of set up. We need to kind of still set that up a little bit for our WPF project. So we'll do CI/CD process entirely for WPF. And then we can actually have it put in a place we can download that file or that installer, whichever we choose, and then run that application, and it will talk to our live API. So that's the next step along the process, I think, of setting up this entire continuous integration, continuous deployment for all of our different pieces of the TimCo Retail Manager system. All right, so that's where we're at. That's where we're going. And I think once we get all this kind of wrapped up, we'll have a system in place where you can actually just use it yourself. You can actually download the WPF project and work against the API. And maybe we'll set up some code so you can actually do something at least. I don't want you to actually mess with inventory, because then everyone would be doing it and that'd be a little bit of a mess. But maybe at least something you can see that it actually works on your machine too. So with that, I think we're done for this video. There's a little bit of configuration, a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of tracking down errors, which happens all the time. The biggest thing is don't panic and don't assume. Because if you take it step by step, and if you say, okay, what's the real problem here? And so we had those two different SQL deploys. We tested both of those to make sure it wasn't just the SQL script versus the DACPack file. And then we tested out the different type of tasks to see if that was it. And it wasn't it. But those error messages kind of gave us a little bit of a clue of what the problem was. And the problem was that PowerShell wasn't on our system that we were running. And it was on Ubuntu. So we looked at that and we said, hey, we could change that if we wanted to. We can run off of Windows 2019, which has PowerShell installed by default. And so we did, and it solved the problem. So taking it step by step helped us solve the problem. We didn't panic. We didn't bang our head against the desk, at least not too much. I paused the video. But by looking at this and looking at logically and thinking through possibilities and narrowing down possibilities, it helped us, instead of just saying, hey, internet, what's my problem? I could have gone on Stack Overflow and posted a Stack Overflow question and said, hey, what's my problem here? But I haven't done enough research yet. I really want you to do the work first before you just ask somebody. Okay? And that's what I hope you saw in this video. All right. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.